This morning before business, we're going to celebrate the Lord's Supper. I hope you're all prepared with a communion cup. If not, you can find that at the back or look for one of the tellers in your section to have one. It was our desire today to set the table with friends and to remember some of our friends who've gone to their eternal reward. Now, the traditional memorial scroll that represents those who've crossed the finish line will be displayed throughout this morning's devotion. In addition, this scroll is being displayed all throughout council in the prayer room, so that if the family members of those who have gone before want to get a picture and capture it, you can go there and do that. It's my delight today to introduce two individuals who'll be leading us in communion. Both of these men I've had the privilege of working for, and they have shaped my life greatly. From 2007 to 2017, Dr. George Wood served as the General Superintendent of this fellowship, and prior to that, Brother Thomas Trask served this fellowship from 1993 to 2007, and both of them are going to lead us as we participate in communion. Would you join me in showing an appropriate response to two of our former General Superintendents, Dr. George Wood and Brother Thomas Trask? Come on, Dr. Wood.
Thank you so much. On behalf of Brother Trask and myself, what a joy it is to be here with you today and to serve the Lord. I'm very mindful that behind me the names of those who have served this fellowship so well are scrolling and now are on the other side. I am 3 weeks from my 80th birthday, and I realize as I go through my daily prayer list how many have dropped off that prayer list in the last few years, who have received the promotion and heard the words, "Well done, good and faithful." So as part of our memorial service today, we honor those who have served this fellowship with such sacrifice, dedication, and distinction. I want to talk to you for a few moments today before we take the elements about communion. Talk to you about what is the meaning of communion. What are we thinking? What are we saying to ourselves and to one another as we share in the taking of the bread and the fruit of the vine? The first communion was at a table with friends. Of course, there was one exception who was not a friend, Judas. But we are here at this table today and at this General Council at a table also with friends. So what should this moment mean to us at General Council as we share in communion? Well, we learn what it means when we look at what it meant to Jesus in that very first communion. There are 5 things that I want to point out. Simply this. First, there is an intense desire of the Lord to be here. Luke chapter 22, verse 15, literally translated says, "With desire I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer." Notice the intensity. It's not just I desire, but with desire, I desire. Jesus had carefully planned and protected the meeting that was to take place. He had sent Peter and John from Bethany into the city of Jerusalem to meet a man carrying a jug of water. It was almost like a clandestine meeting that he was arranging, protecting the space so it could not be intruded in that moment. And they found a large upper room which was furnished. I wonder, the Lord had many things to say to them during this time, but as I try to get inside the Lord's mind, I sense He's going to be going through the loneliest moment of his life. There are really 2 kinds of loneliness. There's the loneliness of isolation and the loneliness of insulation. The loneliness of isolation is when you are on a deserted island, or when you're a young person and you leave home for the first time and you don't know anybody. Here at General Council, we're not in that kind of loneliness, but you can be in the middle of a crowd and know the loneliness of insulation. Although you're with people, you feel very much alone and dealing with issues that maybe no one knows about, including the person that is sitting next to you. Jesus wanted in those final moments at the Last Supper to at least break his own loneliness of isolation by being with his friends. They could not enter into his loneliness of insulation, for none of us would know the difficult travail that he would pass through, but they could share in his presence. And he has come to enter our loneliness, both of isolation and insulation. He is here, he says, wherever 2 or 3 of you gather in my name, I am in the midst. He is here, he is here, and as the wonderful song of the Charismatic Renewal says, and he wants to work among us. He is here as we gather in his name. We want to be here, but more than anyone else, Jesus wants to be here in this moment with us as we gather together. The second thing about the meaning of communion in that first instance and now as well is the Lord corrects our relationships at the table. The issue of top dog had arisen more than once in Jesus' ministry. In fact, it had occurred twice before the occasion of the Last Supper. Once after the Transfiguration, when the 9 disciples were jealous of the 3 that had gotten special attention, and then there was the request of James and John to be seated at his right and left hand as they were approaching Jerusalem. Now on Passover night, the disciples are unwilling to wash each other's feet, and then again, it is a question of who is the top dog. On the very night of all nights, when Jesus could and should have demanded service, he served, washing their feet with a towel. And I wonder if in the following years, if the disciples so many times didn't want to replay that moment. The Lord has much to say to us always, but he cannot say it to us unless our relationships are well. When we are at the communion table, he is reminding us not just of our relationship with him, but our relationship with one another, and saying to us at that table, I want this moment to be a moment when your relationship is corrected if it is in error. One gospel writer has said, Christ has invited us to sit at his table, and we dare not introduce hostilities of race or national jealousies, the envy or contempt which arise from social distinctions. We are equally his guests and friends, Jew and Gentile, Greek and barbarian, master and slave. Here we forget our differences in our common blessedness and glory. Is Jesus talking to us in this moment about relationships? Before you take the bread and the cup, will you offer those relationships and any brokenness in those relationships to him? Third, at this table, he requests us to remember. Remember this, he says, until I come. Jesus literally had nothing physical to leave his own. He had no photos, he had no money, no credit cards, no clothing, no symbolic treasures, nothing. All he asks us to do is to remember. And many years later, 60 years after his death and resurrection, the apostle would remind us that Jesus from heaven was saying, remember your first love. W.R. Newell, a biblical commentator, says, consider a newly married couple. Their life is one of continuous affection, delight in one another. Service is not service for such a bride or groom, but gladness. But the years go by and their relationship dulls. Jesus is asking us at a time like this to stoke the fire of our relationship with him and to remember in a fresh way what he did for us. Truly amazing. You know, I realize that all of us at one time or another have had brokenness in our lives, and maybe you're going through a brokenness right now in your own experience. And the Lord sees that. And as we remember His great love for us, as I've grown older, I've realized that God has a stronger grip on me than I have on Him. And His love reaches deep and wide to us. And we are to constantly remember that it's His love that draws us to Him. So He calls us to remember in taking the bread and the cup. And then He warns us about betrayal and failure. They all say, "Is it I? Is it I?" And of course, He says to them, "I've prayed for you, especially to Peter, that your faith fail not." Those whose names are being scrolled on the screen are persons in whom there was no ministerial failure. They completed their journey. But always when we were at communion, we have to ask that question reflectively, "Lord, is it I? Will I be faithful? Will I serve you? Will I be constant and true?" And then the last thing about communion that it seems to me it represents both in the first communion and the communion now is He explains to us through the bread and the cup His physical absence in the future. He says, "As often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until He come." Until He come. Where is Jesus now? He's physically preparing a place for us. In earth, He had the tradesman of a carpenter, so I suspect He's building a pretty good place. He is presently pouring out His Spirit, and He is unwilling that any should be lost. On the eve of Calvary and His death, Jesus manifests complete confidence in His future by saying, "As you eat this bread and drink this cup, you do so until I come." You know, if you've ever had the experience of having a Seder in the Jewish observance of the Passover, you know that there are 4 times in the Haggadah, the ritual, when the cup, the fruit of the vine, is lifted in blessing. The first time is at the beginning of the meal as sort of a commencement prayer. The second time a cup is lifted is before the main meal and after the eating of the bitter herbs and spices and the story of the Passover. The third time the cup is lifted is after the meal and the prayer. Sometimes this is called the cup of redemption. And the fourth time the cup is lifted is after the singing of the Hallel, which is Psalms 113 to Psalm 118. And that concludes the meal, because what follows next is simply a statement, "Next year in Jerusalem." What is really fascinating about the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew is this little nugget of information. "I tell you," Jesus says, "I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. What's striking is that they did not take the last cup. They sang the hymn and went out. In other words, it appears that Jesus prematurely ended the first communion at the third cup, the cup of redemption, and waited for a later time for the fourth cup, the cup of consummation. When He drinks that fourth cup, we will all drink it with Him. Picture that great banquet hall, the marriage supper of the Lamb, a hall so vast it stretches out as far as the eye could see, but so intimate each one feels apart. Look at the tables, all set with linens and dishes and utensils of heaven, ornamented with dazzling elegance and beauty. Banners stream from vaulted ceilings, and visual delight presses on the senses from rainbows of color fashioned from the palette of the master artist. The room is so breathtaking in its beauty, one can scarcely take it in. And the sound, the music. Throughout the banquet room, orchestras are playing instruments known and unknown with such symphony in praise. Harps are singing, cymbals flashing, trumpets sounding, wind chimes ringing, bells and horns, lutes and violins, dulcimers and clarinets. And from time to time, the instruments die down so that the vast angel choirs positioned throughout the assembly room break forth in such harmony of joy and praise to God so as to banish every member of the pain-filled night of earth. A powerful angel steps to the rostrum and announces to the assembled crowd of men, angels, and heavenly beings, "Please stand at your place. The meal will begin momentarily." A hush falls in the room. We look at those standing near us and further out to the vast tapestry of guests in grand assembly. We cannot help but notice faces of joy all around and eyes that glisten with happiness. Entering now to the head table is the company of the apostles, prophets, and martyrs who bore the burden in the heat of the day and remained faithful and true. And then the moment comes. The last earthly guest is standing at his or her place. Another mighty angel announces the entry of the honored guest. "I present to you the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, Jesus of Nazareth." Trumpets begin their fanfare. Myriads of angels lift their harmony of hallelujahs. A heavenly honor guard waving flags and streamers fills the hall. And then he enters, majestic in his beauty, the Son of Man, the Son of God, strides to his place of honor. Silence falls. His voice breaks the stillness. "Welcome to my marriage supper. Let us take the cup of consummation, and together with him, saints of all ages, nations, languages, cultures, from villages and cities, farms and desert places, all of us, heads garland with the imperishable crown of life, will take the chalice and lift our golden cup in toast to him and his finished work. And in that moment, we drink the fourth cup, the cup of consummation. Redemption's saga is complete, and the eternal age is opened up before us. Oh, what a day until he comes.